Senate confirms Erica Schwartz as CDC director. Reuters, The New York Times, PBS, and NPR report that lawmakers have approved new leadership for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The development matters because the agency is still central to outbreak guidance, public risk communication, and coordination with state health departments. Confirmation gives the administration a named official who can be judged on dated decisions rather than acting off as signals. For the public, the practical question is how quickly leadership changes show up in disease surveillance, staffing choices, and plain language notices from the agency. Coverage also notes that the agency has been described as troubled, so early management decisions will draw scrutiny from lawmakers, medical groups, and state officials. The next reliable checkpoint is a CDC statement, Senate oversight response, or dated public health bulletin that shows what priorities change first. Until then, the grounded takeaway is straightforward. A leadership vacancy has been filled, and the consequences will be measured through official agency actions, and the first tests include outbreak messaging, advisory committee management, state coordination, budget priorities, data system reliability, workforce morale, and whether lawmakers receive clearer answers when they ask how the agency will handle the next public emergency, including respiratory outbreaks, vaccine guidance, lab alerts, state requests, hospital coordination. Congressional oversight and funding policy choices overall. Trump Marine 1 flight under investigation after potential safety mishap. Reuters, Axios, The Washington Post, and The Guardian report that the FAA is examining a helicopter safety incident in Washington involving the presidential aircraft and a passenger jet. The confirmed frame is an aviation safety review, not a finished finding of fault. That distinction matters because investigators still have to establish spacing, communications, procedures, and any corrective steps. For travelers and nearby residents, the story is about how high-security flights interact with ordinary air traffic in a crowded capital region. For officials, it is a test of whether procedures around restricted movements need clearer coordination between controllers, pilots, security teams, and airport operators. Viewers should wait for the FAA record before assigning blame or assuming motive. The next useful checkpoint is an agency update, incident timeline, or safety recommendation that names what happened and how it will be prevented. Until that appears, the verified point is that federal aviation officials are investigating a close call concern around a sensitive flight. Investigators may also examine radio traffic, altitude instructions, crew procedures, route planning, passenger jet separation, and whether any temporary flight restrictions or controller workload issues contributed to a situation that needs correction before another high-profile movement in the same crowded corridor near national security sites and airports again. U.S. refunds $100 billion in tariffs struck down by Supreme Court, filing shows. Reuters, NBC News, CNBC, and The Guardian report that the administration has repaid a large sum tied to duties invalidated in court. The number matters because it turns a legal ruling into a budget, customs, and trade policy event. Importers will want to know whether repayments are automatic, contested, or still subject to later administrative steps. Consumers and businesses will watch whether the refund process changes prices, supply contracts, or expectations for future tariff actions. Trading partners will also read the filings for signs of how durable Washington's trade tools are after judicial review. The key public distinction is between money already returned and broader claims still moving through official channels. The next reliable signal is a court order, customs bulletin, or government filing that explains remaining exposure. Until those records change, the grounded takeaway is that a tariff fight has produced a major refund and a fresh test of executive trade authority. The outcome will also matter for companies deciding whether to challenge other levies, budget writers estimating revenue, customs brokers advising clients, and allies judging whether similar duties could survive when challenged in court, especially if more refund claims arrive from importers this year after revised invoices and compliance audits soon. Feds cook ready to raise rates if inflation doesn't start easing. Reuters, Bloomberg, CNBC, and the Business Times report that the Federal Reserve Governor signaled willingness to act if price pressure remains too strong. The comment matters because markets listen for whether policymakers see inflation as cooling, stuck, or broadening again. Higher rate language can affect bond yields, mortgage expectations, credit card costs, and business investment plans even before a formal vote. The nuance is that readiness is conditional, not a promise of immediate action. Officials still need consumer price data, labor market reports, and financial conditions before the next decision. For households, the practical issue is whether borrowing costs stay elevated because inflation progress is too slow. For investors, the issue is whether rate cut timing moves farther out. The next reliable checkpoint is the next inflation release and any matching comments from other voting officials. Until then, the verified takeaway is that the central bank debate remains data-dependent and inflation is still driving the policy conversation that makes every word from Fed officials important for banks, employers, renters, savers, and borrowers who need to plan around the possibility that restrictive policy lasts longer than markets hoped. Particularly if services prices and wages stay firm into autumn reports and credit conditions, tighten for households and small businesses nationally again tomorrow. New Mexico sues Trump administration for unredacted Epstein files in Zorro Ranch investigation. The New York Times, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and The Times report that state officials are challenging the Justice Department over records connected to the Epstein inquiry. The dispute matters because it turns public demands for transparency into a records fight with legal deadlines and formal responses. New Mexico's interest centers on what happened at Zorro Ranch and what documents federal officials are willing or required to release. For the public, the key distinction is between allegations, sealed or redacted records, and material that becomes part of an official court file. The coverage also shows how state and federal authority can collide when a politically sensitive investigation remains partly hidden. The next reliable checkpoint is a docket entry, Justice Department response, or judge's order describing what must be produced. Until then, the grounded takeaway is that the state is seeking fuller access. While the factual record still depends on documents rather than claims outside court, the outcome could show whether state investigators can force more detail from federal files, whether privacy or investigative limits keep portions sealed, and whether any released material changes the timeline already known to victims and officials, including ranch-related evidence, correspondence, agency explanations, redaction justifications, and custody records. The Atlantic hurricane season has been calm so far. Will it last? The Washington Post, USA Today, Miami Herald, and Ars Technica report that forecasters are assessing why storm activity has been quieter and what could still develop. The story matters because a slow start does not remove coastal risk for the rest of the season. Emergency managers, insurers, and residents still need to track outlooks, evacuation zones, and name storm forecasts as ocean and atmospheric conditions change. The practical point is preparedness rather than reassurance. Quieter weeks can make people less ready if activity rises later. Forecast coverage also affects travel planning, energy markets, and local budgets for response staffing. Viewers should rely on National Hurricane Center updates and local emergency offices, not viral storm maps without dates or sources. The next reliable checkpoint is an official outlook, named system advisory, or local preparedness notice. Until then, the verified takeaway is that early activity has stayed muted, but public agencies are still watching for later risk. That means families should check insurance, supplies, evacuation routes, prescription needs, generator safety, and county alerts before a named system appears. Because preparation becomes harder once warnings are already active across the Gulf and Atlantic coasts during peak season and holiday travel windows for coastal communities now statewide safely again. Trump repeats false reflecting pool vandalism claim without evidence. AP News, the Killeen Daily Herald, Palestine Herald, and Inquirer report that the former president repeated an unsupported account involving the Washington landmark. The story matters because a claim about public property can move through politics before evidence catches up. Reporters frame the central issue as verification, whether officials responsible for the site have records supporting the allegation. For the public, the practical lesson is to separate a repeated statement from a documented finding, especially when the subject involves public institutions and civic spaces. The coverage also illustrates how quickly a visual or symbolic location can become part of a broader political message. The next reliable checkpoint is a dated statement from the agency managing the site, a police record, or documentation of actual damage. Until that appears, the grounded takeaway is that major outlets found the claim unsupported, and the public record should lead the story rather than repetition. This matters for accountability because officials, reporters, and voters need a shared record of what actually happened before claims about public spaces are used to justify blame policy demands or enforcement responses from federal or local authorities in Washington and park agencies responsible for maintenance logs and site inspections, today publicly for accountability records and public documentation. Live updates: Trump says Strait of Hormuz deal could happen soon amid Iran-Oman talks. CBS News, CNBC, The Hill, and The Washington Post report diplomacy around one of the world's most important energy choke points. The story matters because any shift involving Hormuz can affect shipping insurance, oil prices, regional military posture, and inflation expectations far beyond the Gulf. The confirmed reporting points to public comments, talks involving Oman, and competing signals about how close an arrangement might be. For the public, the important discipline is to treat live updates as moving pieces until named governments publish firm terms. A deal would need details on navigation, security guarantees, enforcement, and what each side says it will do next. Markets and allies will watch whether the rhetoric lowers risk or simply pauses escalation. The next reliable checkpoint is an official statement from the parties, a maritime advisory or confirmed diplomatic text. Until then, the verified takeaway is that Hormuz diplomacy is active but not yet proven by a final public record. The talks also intersect with naval deployments, tanker routes, sanctions enforcement, regional messaging, and domestic politics in each capital. So even limited wording from officials can move expectations before any durable arrangement exists for ships, insurers, and energy buyers watching Gulf routes and oil futures daily. Russia drone company chief injured in car bombing. Financial Times, The Guardian, CBS News, and NBC News report that the head of a Russian drone manufacturer was seriously hurt in an explosion. The story matters because drone production is tied directly to the war effort, and attacks on executives or facilities can carry both operational and symbolic weight. Early reports about bombings are often incomplete, so the public should separate confirmed injury details from claims about responsibility. The practical question is whether the incident affects production, security around defense firms, or retaliation messaging from Russian authorities. It also shows how the conflict reaches people and infrastructure away from the front line. The next reliable checkpoint is a police update, company statement, court record, or military-linked confirmation that explains what investigators believe happened. Until then, the grounded takeaway is that a senior figure in Russia's drone industry was hurt, and the significance depends on official findings, not unverified wartime speculation. Further confirmation may clarify whether the blast was criminal, political, or war-linked, whether security protocols changed for defense companies, and whether Russian authorities connect the case to broader pressure on weapons production, procurement networks, executive security, factory leadership. Wartime logistics, supply contracts, regional policing, industrial recruitment, sanctions-sensitive components, insurance costs, and plant access for plant managers. The war that's happening above Russia and Ukraine. National Security Journal, the New York Times, Kyiv Post, and the Irish Times describe an air war shaped by missiles, drones, defenses, and pressure on cities. The story matters because control of the skies influences civilian risk, battlefield logistics, and the political demand for more air defense systems. Reports about repeated strikes on Kyiv and Ukrainian limits and stopping them show why the issue is not only tactical. It is also about industrial supply, allied commitments, and repair speed after attacks. Coverage of stress inside Russia adds another layer, but wartime claims still require careful sourcing. For the public, the practical question is whether Ukraine receives enough interceptors, sensors, and replacement equipment to reduce the damage from future salvos. The next reliable checkpoint is a military update, allied procurement announcement, or verified damage assessment after a new strike. Until then, the verified takeaway is that the aerial contest remains central to the wider war, and its civilian consequences. That means the next phase turns on air defense deliveries, stockpile depth, production timelines, repair capacity, power grid protection, and whether Moscow or Kyiv changes strike patterns after each round of attacks on cities, factories, logistics hubs, energy sites, rail corridors, depots, substations, repair crews, and command posts near active wartime borders.